Everyone, good afternoon and welcome to a special educational event on biodiversity, the essential survival strategy for the climate crisis. My name is Anne-Christine Strugnell and I am the Communications Director here at the Environmental Forum of Marin. I'd like to begin with a really brief acknowledgement that here in Marin County, we are in fact on unceded traditional homelands of the Coast Miwok people. Environmental Forum of Marin has been running for about 50 years now. Our mission is environmental education and advocacy training. Basically, we want to help people who live in this beautiful place to understand it better and to protect it against the many things that could degrade our environment. Last year, we did a series called Forum 2020, which focused on the climate crisis and educating people about the causes and consequences of the climate crisis. And this year, we're running Forum 2021. So no surprise to any of us, sadly, the climate crisis has not been resolved. But what we're doing this year is we're looking at it through a slightly different lens. We're looking at it through the lens of biodiversity, because biodiversity, or I should say biodiversity loss, is one of the biggest consequences of the climate crisis. And conversely, protecting biodiversity could well be our best hope for resilience in the face of the climate crisis. I'd like to go on to thank our sponsors because the registration fees that we pay do not fully cover the cost of putting on these events. The difference is made up by the generosity of our sponsors. Today's event is sponsored by the Marin Conservation League, the Marin Community Foundation, Marin Link, the Sierra Club, Point Reyes National Seashore Association, and MALT, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. The agenda for today is, we're going to start off with David Ackerley, who's going to be talking about biodiversity and climate. Then we're moving on to Justin Robinson, who's going to be talking about the intersection between people and plants. And then Mark Hertsgaard is going to be talking about global biodiversity protection, and also he's going to be putting questions to the speakers and leading a discussion. So to get us all warmed up, I have a couple of poll questions. Let's start off with one that might be easy. Let's see. So which of the 50 states is home to more species of plants and animals and has the highest number of species found nowhere else? Is it California? Is it Wyoming? Is it Mississippi? Let's see what the numbers come up. Oh my gosh, everybody's saying California. Is it just because you all are from California? Oh, let's see. All right. All right, it's looking like California, even if we get some late Wyoming voters in there, California is going to be the answer that you've all chosen. Thank you very much. So yes, the answer is California. But what I want you all to know is that California isn't just really special among the 50 states. It's also a global biodiversity hotspot. There are not that many of them around the world. It depends on who's counting, 30, 33, 35. But the point is, a global biodiversity hotspot is defined as a place where there's a really high number of plant and animal species that are found nowhere else. And California is one of the global biodiversity hotspots. It's called the California Floristic Province, which I personally think sounds beautiful. And it kind of leads me to my follow-up question for you all. Of the original, so if we can move on to the second poll question, it goes like this. Of the original vegetation of the California Floristic Province, what percentage remains in more or less pristine condition? Is it 87%? Is it 25%? Or is it 18%? Let's give you all a moment to contemplate that one. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 18s. Not many people are thinking 87. Okay, some 25s are coming in there. Okay, I'm gonna wait a few more seconds. Well, it's looking like 18 is the winner. So actually, I have good news for you all. It's closer to 25. They think 25%, between 25 and 30% of the original vegetation in the California Floristic Province is in more or less pristine condition. Sadly, that is not a really big percentage, and we're just talking about vegetation in that poll, and we have not mentioned the 300 animal species that seem to have gone extinct in the California floristic province. So things are not that great, but it seems like it's a great time to queue up our speaker, David Ackerley. Now that we've hinted at the scope of the challenge, I'd like to introduce David Ackerley. He's the Dean of UC Berkeley's Rausser College of Natural Resources, with joint appointments in the departments of integrative biology and environmental science, policy, and management. His research interests include climate change impacts on biodiversity, the integration of phylogenetics and ecology, and conservation biology. His research is used to inform strategies of biodiversity conservation in the face of climate change, with a focus on California parks and open space. So, David, what do you want us all to understand about biodiversity?
I've spoken to the Environmental Forum previously, but it must be many years ago now at an in-person event. At the time, talking about fire, and of course, we're still talking about fire, and I won't feature it in my remarks, but of course, we might want to come back in the Q&A, given how important that is. Yeah, I just want to open, and I have a few minutes here. I'm gonna jump into a few slides in the middle, but actually mostly speak without slides, which always maybe is a surprise when you get an academic to talk. And it's partly just because it's less about giving you a set of facts or giving you a set of particular pieces of information, and more just reflecting on some bigger picture thoughts and questions, and also asking you to reflect a little bit on your own experience. So let me just set it up that way. I also, please don't let me go on without thanking the organizers for a wonderful invitation. I'm very honored to be here with Mark Hertsgaard and with Justin Robinson, and looking forward to their remarks as well. So given that our topic is biodiversity, I can maybe play an appropriate role here to just kick it off and make sure we are all on the same page about what we mean when we talk about biodiversity. And what's disarming about it as a term is that in some ways it is everything. It is the entire living world around us. And that's the beauty, is that it's just this one word we can use that can capture all of that living world. On the other hand, that's of course maybe something worth reflecting on more deeply, because there's lots of pieces to the living world around us. And that's a little bit what I want to kind of start by thinking about. So the first thing to say is, it's very common when we talk about biodiversity to start saying how many species are there, and knowing the species in your backyard or in a park. And that's a good starting point. But it's always important to be thinking about biodiversity, not just as, it's not a list of species. It's a set of functional relationships, it's predator-prey relationships, it's where things live, the fact that you might have redwoods in a gully and the shrublands up on the hill, that's part of the patterns of biodiversity. It's all of the genetics of all those plants and animals in the wild. And within even what we call one species, of course, there's enormous genetic diversity. Every individual isn't alike. Of course, we only have to think of humans to know that very well. We're all different, we're all unique. And think about the fact that every tree out there, even within a species, is unique in that same way, and yet in ways that are invisible to us, that we can't really be aware of. So that's the first thing, is just to always think it's about pattern and process and where things live and what's out there and their relationships to each other. And what does it mean to have an ecosystem that is functioning as a whole, where all of the species in that ecosystem are interacting and able to grow, thrive, reproduce, do what animals and plants do in the world. It's also, of course, important. I've kind of queued this up by saying, oh, redwood or shrubland, but what about the tree in your backyard? What about your garden? What about the weed in the sidewalk? And then, of course, what about our farmlands and the vineyards? All of those plants came from somewhere. We didn't make them up. We didn't create them. They're all, all of our domesticated plants and animals come from things that have wild ancestors. And of course, if we really think about, if I asked you right now, what aspect of biodiversity do you depend on right now? Well, it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that, that's our first dependence, is on all of the thriving agroecosystems or agricultural systems that provide us our sustenance. So think of it broadly. Don't only go to sort of the native ecosystems or the parks when we think about biodiversity, because all of these elements are important. Now, ironically, even a disease is part of biodiversity, even a bacterium, even a virus. So we actually don't like all of the biodiversity out there in the world. There are, the living world brings with it surprises, brings with it things that actually can undermine our quality of life. And we have to figure out what we do with that as well. And I'll come back and talk more about how much this is about a set of values that we bring, as much as it's about a set of scientific questions. So that, so that's both a very broad definition, but a really important one. I mean, that does capture a lot of what we would call a scientific definition of what biodiversity really means. And clearly, if we think about biodiversity as a solution to a crisis, before it's even a solution, it's just the foundation of our life. We are wholly dependent on a living world and all of its functioning. And there's one of my colleagues has a favorite saying that the human economic system is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural system, in the sense that everything we do functions within the fact that we have air to breathe and water to drink. And whatever we think about our economy and our businesses, without these things we almost take for granted that are part of what really is the world endowed to us, is the natural world we evolved in and that we occupy, we wouldn't be doing any of the rest of it. We wouldn't be doing all of our technology or whatever it might be. Now I want to pause though and ask you to think a little bit about this from a more personal framework. And the way I do this, and this is hard on Zoom, and I'm just going to ask you to do this in your head, and you take it where you take it. Maybe we'll have some discussion later. Pause for a moment, close your eyes, and especially think about your childhood, because that's where our identities are formed fundamentally. Whatever else we go through in life, a lot is formed early. And think about a sense of place. Like, what's a place that really means something to you and that is important to you in your upbringing? And it might be nature, but it might not be. It might be a city, right? It might be something very man-made. It might be something natural. And then the question I want to ask, and we're going to come back towards the end, is, can you, wherever this place is, can you imagine it being different than what it was in your childhood? And that difference is actually something that you would think of as like, oh, that would be an improvement. Like, that place would have been a lot nicer if it was different than it was. And I want to posit to you two comments. Some of you might say yes, because you could have grown up in circumstances that, like, your sense of place as a child was actually not a place that may have been filled with a lot of happiness, that there were things about it that were, if it was an inner city environment, you said, oh, even growing up, I was aware that was like, I wish it wasn't all like that. I wish it wasn't dirty or something like that. Although even there, you know that people still go back because that's home. If you thought of a natural place, and I count myself so lucky. For me, this is a place, this is New Hampshire. These are forests in New Hampshire for me. I can't imagine them being different and being better. And what would it mean for them to be better than what they were like when I was a kid? Because that sense of place is so much a sense of identity. And I think for many of us, and I never want to speak for everyone, but I think, and I'm going to guess that some of you, this will resonate. When you connect with nature, and especially a place that you grew up with, that sense of place is really tied to a sense of familiarity and knowledge and what it was like. And if it were different, it would no longer be that place that we grew up. And it's a source of attachment. It can be a source of real comfort, or a place that we go for sort of our well-being. And this is really important, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is, how do we live in a world that's changing? How do we live in a world where the biological world is changing? Not only the social world, not only the technological world, but the biological world around us. And of course, we're seeing these changes, accelerating every day. So hold that thought, and certainly maybe in the Q&A we can come back. So what is this key connection between ecosystems and climate? Now, I've mentioned clean air, clean water. There are so many ways in which natural ecosystems are essential to our well-being, or can provide services that maybe we could replace technologically, but nature provides them in a very efficient way. Think of a salt marsh. Think of the San Pablo Bay salt marshes in China Camp or Novato. Yes, we could build seawalls. Maybe we'd be forced to build seawalls if we want to preserve some aspects of our infrastructure. But those salt marshes are so efficient at absorbing storm surges and managing the tides, and as well as managing the outflow of the freshwater and all the wildlife they support. And that's nature providing us a service, and if we choose, we can go down the path of trying to value that service. Let's put a price on that or a value on that. So that there's a wide range of those services. But let's just think about climate. Right now, we are facing an existential crisis. I don't need to educate this audience on this, driven by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and their impact on the climate. We absolutely under an imperative, if we are going to get through this century without just devastating impacts, to stop emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, and to start capturing and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And of course, ideally, we want CO2 to go down. I mean, stabilizing it would be a huge success. Going down, of course, would put us on a path to a really sustainable future. So what do ecosystems do? Well, plants are carbon factories. This is what plants eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is carbon. And they take it out of the atmosphere and they capture their leaves. And then the process of photosynthesis, convert that into sugars and starches, and they build a plant. All of the wood in a trunk of a tree, is all built from carbon taken right out of the atmosphere. So healthy ecosystems are essential to an essential part of the strategy to address the climate crisis, because growing trees and vibrant ecosystems can help capture carbon and bring it out of the atmosphere. Now, the challenge, of course, though, is that ecosystems also give up carbon to the atmosphere. And the main way they do this is when things decompose. So if you see a leaf fall from a tree and it rots, you go, oh, there's a rotting leaf. Well, what's a rotting leaf? A rotting leaf is a leaf full of fungus and bacteria, and they're consuming all that dead matter. They're eating. And as they eat, they're consuming the energy. And as they consume the energy, they do the same thing we do. They burn the carbohydrate and they release the CO2, just like when we exhale, we release CO2 to the atmosphere. So plants are taking up CO2, but we have to keep it on the ground if they're going to play a role in solving the climate crisis. And there's really kind of three fundamental places that carbon can stay on the ground. One is to grow trees that stay on that survive for a long time. Okay. The other is to capture carbon into roots in actually trees, shrubs, rangelands, what have you. And the roots take it deep down into the soil. And when the roots, even if the roots die and decompose, some of that carbon stays in the soil. But if it's not deep down in the soil, it's liable to be captured by those microbes, consumed, and released back to the atmosphere. Another really important one is actually salt marshes and mangrove marshes. I mean, that's kind of like the soils, but it's a very special environment when carbon gets into a waterlogged situation. So carbon-rich soils that are saturated with water, that really slows down and changes the activity of all those decomposers. They aren't able to decompose the carbon, and this is what we call peat. So when you talk about a peat bog, like in Scotland, where people would dig up peat and burn it, that is carbon-rich organic matter that's been waterlogged, and because it's waterlogged, it hasn't decomposed. It hasn't been lost to the atmosphere. In fact, our very own California Delta had a lot of peat in these waterlogged environments, and as the Delta was drained for agriculture, a lot of that carbon has now decomposed and gone up to the atmosphere. So marshes and below ground and trees. Now the trees present a challenge to us, because what do trees do? They do burn. Not every tree, not every year, but of course we're seeing this across California. So for forests to play a really significant role in the climate crisis, we can't stop fire, but we have to account for fire. We have to not just be optimistic and say every tree we grow will stay for the next 100 years. They won't all stay, and we have to keep that into our accounting. And then we have to manage for healthier forests that when they burn, we lose less carbon. And this takes us down the entire discussion about prescribed burning, fuel management, and promoting lower severity fires. Hugely important for California. So we can also take that up. So healthy ecosystems are key. Now I do want to pause and make sure this is something that I think we can all just need to be clear about. Ecosystems alone will not solve the climate crisis. if we do not get off fossil fuels, nothing we do with natural ecosystems is sufficient to offset the carbon that is being emitted from burning fossil fuels. And you will see claims that people will claim that soils alone could solve the entire climate crisis and could take up all the carbon that's being emitted. And first, I really don't believe the science supports that. But also, we have to be very careful because there are a lot of people out there who would love that to be true, because then they don't have to stop burning fossil fuels. And we can all keep enjoying our lifestyle and traveling and flying and having our gas guzzling cars and our high consumption, all of our energy use. And we can't do that. So we have to be careful not to over promote the role of ecosystems and let anyone think they're off the hook for the importance of emissions reduction. So that's just a really important placeholder. Today is mostly about biodiversity, but this is not a replacement for everything we need to do about transforming our energy systems. So we want vibrant ecosystems, but now here's the challenge. Drought stress and fires and a changing climate are themselves a threat to a vibrant ecosystem. So at the very time that we want trees that are growing fast or growing vigorously or capturing carbon or healthy soils, the changing climate is undermining the potential for that. And we're really just in a race against time. I mean, will climate change happen so quickly that many ecosystems have their functioning undermined? Or can we do enough with emissions reduction and managing for resilient ecosystems? And I'll talk more about what that might mean, that we stay ahead of it and we can keep these systems functioning well. So we know that the changing climate is itself a threat. Every time we see a tree dying from drought, every time we see a disease expanding its range because of climate or a pathogen or a pest, every time we see a catastrophic fire that is so much bigger because of climate change, is another setback towards our goals of ecosystems playing the role we hope they can play. I think I promised slides. I'm actually going to skip them because we're going to stay on schedule for this session. And I can tell you what's in the slides because I'll just have a vivid imagination. It's really just some maps and pictures. One of the topics that was mentioned in our program is about thinking about how ecosystems migrate. And that's really what that's pictures of, but let's just describe this. And what do we mean when we talk about nature migrating in response to climate change? So again, let's start with that point that we're really concerned about having healthy, vibrant ecosystems. That means having trees. I'm very focused on trees, unapologetically. I'm a tree biologist, but other animals, other plants, all the parts of the ecosystem that are growing in places where the conditions are appropriate and suitable for their growth. Okay. As climate changes, the conditions are becoming unsuitable for many species. It's too hot, it's too dry, the fire intensities are too severe. So what does it look like when that happens? What it looks like is a tree dying from a drought. And we're seeing that around us. We're seeing it in the Bay Area during this year's drought. We saw it in 2015. And I'm sure many of you have seen the pictures of the Sierra Nevada dieback, 2014, 2015, 2016. We had about 120 million trees die, something on the order of 10% of California's trees. So those pictures with those brown hills, that's actually what migration looks like. And that may not be obvious at first because this, I know you know, trees don't migrate. Individual trees don't migrate. Trees germinate, they grow, they're not going anywhere. The only way a tree species shifts is that the trees that are no longer in the suitable conditions die. They might die in a drought. But seeds get moved, and then some of them, they germinate. Some of them germinate in places that are now actually really suitable. We're seeing oak trees growing higher in the Sierra Nevada than we saw them 80 years ago. Now, the oak trees didn't know which direction to go. Acorns are moving every which direction, often squirrels, woodpeckers, right? Or maybe there's some species, the seeds are carried on the wind. So the trees are not tracking climate. The seeds are being dispersed in every direction. Some of them land in places that are now more suitable. They grow. Some other trees die because they're in places that are no longer suitable. They die back. And now the range, think about a range map like in a field guide. the range of that species has moved north or moved uphill. And that's really what we mean by migration. It's just the establishment of new individuals at one end and the death of the old individuals at the other end. Now, animals can actually migrate, so it's a somewhat different topic. But vegetation is so key to what we're talking about that it's really the starting point for thinking about healthy ecosystems. So now let's imagine a world where there's no seed dispersal. Everything is fixed where it is. And the conditions start changing. And some of the trees die, but there's no other species available to live there. And an oak tree dies in a drought, it drops an acorn, the acorn germinates, maybe it grows for a while, the next drought, it dies. Over time, this is not a pretty world, because the reason that nature survives periods of climate change is it adapts. It adapts genetically through natural selection. It adapts ecologically by species moving. Species movement is a natural response to climate change. The trees don't know why the climate is changing. The trees don't know the difference between the end of the ice age and the 21st century when humans are pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. They are just, they're dying in a drought, seeds are moving, right? The trees are doing what trees do. And that movement is actually essential to the survival of our natural ecosystems. But that movement means the systems are going to change. It means that new species are going to grow in places that used to grow there. And now I'm taking you back to where we started, thinking about your childhood, that favorite place you might go. Because the change in nature is a symptom of something we're very worried about. It's a symptom of climate change, and especially the widespread mortality. But that change is also the key to the survival of biodiversity. So what do we want our ecosystems to look like in the future? And if we say we want them to look like how they always looked in the past, we will be disappointed. Some places, yes, some stands of redwood may be stands of redwood for another 100 years. Other stands may not recover after a fire and may change. And we've done models in the Bay Area that show that some of the areas of conifer forest could be shrubland, like chaparral, just like covers Mount Tam. That would be a very drastic change in that ecosystem. And it won't be pretty as it happens. If forests burn, if the trees don't recover, if shrublands invade, we're seeing this all through the Sierra Nevada. And yet, on the other hand, we have to be cautious that we don't actually think we want to stop that change, because that is nature doing what it can to survive at a scale that we can't manage. We can't get out of the landscape and plant every tree where we want it. We will have to let natural processes. So the final thought here, when we engage in conservation and biodiversity management or ecosystem management, for years we've been focused on conserving our native biodiversity for very good reasons. These spectacular ecosystems, they've evolved in certain places, they're adapted to those places, but conditions are changing. Now we have to actually step back and ask ourselves what our values are. What values are going to drive our conservation? Because the conservation is a set of tools. It's not a set of norms about what we should do. It's a set of tools about how we can do it. But what we should do is a social dialogue about our values. So a couple examples. If our values are that we want ecosystems to capture as much carbon as fast as possible, that's a perfectly reasonable social goal to help solve climate change. You might say we should plant all eucalyptus because it grows really fast and captures carbon. Remembering, of course, what I said about discounting for fire risk. So eucalypts may not be as good as we think because they burn easily. Redwoods are actually pretty darn good. Maybe we should be trying to convert grasslands to redwoods and shrublands to redwoods anywhere we think they will grow. That would not be our traditional approach to managing some of our parks. But if our value was carbon, we would go down a certain path. What if your value was supporting pollinators, a rich, diverse array of pollinators, hummingbirds, and native bees, and well, those are two of the spectacular pollinators we have, moths and butterflies. Well, if you go out in your back garden, and if you're a gardener, I'm not, and you have a really diverse garden, and you have plants from South Africa, and you have plants from Australia, and you have plants from California, the hummingbirds actually like a lot of them. So you might say, like, well, We're fine planting things from South Africa and Australia that might grow well in a future climate because we want the pollinators and they support the pollinators. But now we're not talking about our commitment to native biodiversity, but that's because we started with a value. And the value could be plants that support pollinators. What if your value is aesthetics? Well, then you have to think about what you think is beautiful. What if your value is restoring ecosystem process, like restoring fire? If that's our value, then we actually have to embrace burned landscapes because we're restoring fire. And burned landscapes challenge a lot of people aesthetically and emotionally. They're scary, and they're scary when people's houses burn down. And there's nothing good about people's houses burning down. We have to find ways to protect homes and lives while we allow fire back into the landscape. But we may need to adjust our aesthetics. And I was up in Lake Tahoe talking to a firefighter, and they've been doing prescribed burning. Some of you may know on the West Shore, they're doing a lot of prescribed burning. And I said, oh, I think those prescribed burns are so beautiful, seeing the scars on the trunks and it's really open. And he's like, not everyone thinks they're beautiful. Not everyone walks into that park and says, what a beautiful park when they see that the understory has been burned. But if our values are going to, maybe we need to adjust our aesthetics to match our values of what we're trying to restore, and then we can sort of bring everything together in a package to what we want our ecosystems to look like. So I'll leave it there. I really want to emphasize how much what we're doing has to be driven by our values, how much we need to be explicit about our values, be upfront and understand them. Why do we want the ecosystems to function and look the way we do, and how can we do that? How are we going to manage the fact that they are changing? And if we resist that change, we won't do anyone a favor, neither the biodiversity nor ourselves. Not all changes are necessarily desirable, but some we will embrace. And how do we differentiate those? And then how do we take this back and integrate it with everything we're doing to address our climate crisis? So I think that is enough to set up our discussion, and I'm only a couple minutes over time. So thank you, Anne-Christine. I look forward to the comments and the Q&A later on.
Thank you, David. Honestly, I could have just kept listening for hours. It's because it's a part of a huge conversation, isn't it? It's not just what's going on, but what is our role in actively making choices, since we have to make choices at this point, and we can't choose, I want things always to be the way they were when I remember. But I really resonated also with what you were saying about the change in the landscapes where we grew up, because for me, that's hard. It's hard going back to where I grew up and seeing change there. It's kind of okay in California. I'm a California transplant. It's all kind of, whatever California does. But when I go home, I expect it to be a certain way. And I think in some ways we're all going to be in exile from where we grew up. And I love the idea of making conscious choices. I think that's a beautiful way to frame it. And I think it's probably the most intelligent way to frame it, because we do have to, we are living in a time of a lot of change. So, in fact, so that brings me to another poll question, which is, scientists estimate that since the 1970s, we have lost what percentage of all plant and animal life on this planet? Now, notice, since the 1970s, some of us were around in the 1970s, it was only 50 years ago. What percentage of plant and animal life on this planet have we lost? Let's see what you guys are guessing here. Ooh, let's see, 50 seems to be like the favorite. It's like the medium, right? Medium size, take medium. Well, actually, there's a range, as you might imagine. There's a range because we can't really tell, but it is between 50 and 68%. It's a lot. And as I say, one of the interesting things, or one of the particularly alarming things, is that that's just in the past 50 years. It's not like since people started cultivating the land or anything like that. But that's probably a great way to cue up our next speaker, Justin Robinson, because he's an ethnobotanist who focuses on the interdependence of people and plants. Now, full disclosure, I had to look up ethnobotany. So I'm going to read you the definition. I can tell you it's the scientific study of the traditional knowledge and customs of a people concerning plants and their medical, religious, and other uses. So Justin, please tell us more about ethnobotany and how it relates to biodiversity.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm Justin Robinson. Was already said, I'm an ethnobotanist. I actually have a degree in forestry, so I'm also a forest manager and lots of other things. I actually don't make clear distinctions between those. I actually think ethnobotanist is the best term, because my definition of ethnobotany is how people use plants. And so all botany is ethnobotany. right? The ethnobotany part probably focuses a little bit more on the cultural aspect, but everybody comes from a culture, so there's no way to have a culturalist base. So what I'm going to be focusing on today, or this, it's evening here. I'm in North Carolina. It's nighttime here. Is sort of an idea about how biodiversity of plants and how that affects who we are as human beings. So first of all, people always ask me, why botany, why plants? People know that I'm a person who's interested in plants and have been for a long time. And so people ask me, why botany and why plants? So for me, it's a fairly easy answer because plants to me are everything, right? Some people think of plants as flowers as decoration in terms of floral arrangement inside your homes or for weddings or whatever other events. You might think of them simply as landscape. You might think of them from more scientific perspective in terms of pollinator habitat, etc. Right? What I put out there is that for me, the way that I think about plants is that I see plants as allies, as assistants, as friends, and as relatives, right? That help human beings navigate the complexity of living on Earth, right? So plants are our allies, right? For the most part, and there's, poisonous plants too. They're not always friendly, but for the most part, plants are our allies in navigating the complexity of being a human being, Homo sapien organism on wherever it is on the Earth one happens to find oneself. So that is where I start, okay? So what do plants do? Some of them were already talked about in the previous thing. So plants offer stormwater protection and stormwater mitigation, as well as storm surge. And you can think about the mangroves off the coast of subtropical areas and tropical areas. One of the things that plants give us is also rain, right? The reason why the rainforest is rainy is not just its latitude, it is because of the plants themselves. Those plants are water pumps. And so the rainforest is so rainy because of the trees, right? So also soil conservation, habitat for all kinds of animals and plants, temperature regulation, we know a lot of this stuff. So that's feels like the stuff that's out there. What plants actually do for us is the basics of human life: food, clothing, shelter, medicine, weapons, instruments. I could go on and on and on. Toilet paper, right? The necessities of human life, right? So our lives are intricately and inextricably tied to plants, okay? So all of those myriad uses of plants, some of which I listed off there, requires biodiversity, right? We don't use the same plants for everything. The same plants that you use for decoration is not the same plant that you may use to make toilet paper out. So this also requires native plants to be able to thrive where they evolved, right? Given the change in climate, for them to be able to be where it is that they're evolved. This requires stability of ecosystem over time. I don't mean unchangingness, I mean stability over time. So, as I already said, I'm in the South, and so here in North Carolina, we are in another biodiversity hotspot on several parts of the state, and we have some of the highest biodiversity in the temperate zone, right behind California. So we used and currently use plants to make our lives more wonderful, more livable, right? So let's take the oak, for instance. Here where I live, it's the white oak that is the king of the king or the queen or the whatever. Maybe we don't need to put that in monarchical terms, but the plant that's doing a lot of the work here in our ecosystem is the white oak. So what does it do for us? It provides us heating, firewood, rafters, floors, chairs, acorn for bread, acorn for bears, acorns for turkeys, bark for stomach aches, right? It supports more than 450 species of animals, insects, birds, mammals, and human beings, right? Indigenous people here where I am used acorns heavily right? Now we have, that idea has mostly become extinct now because of the displacement of indigenous people, but white oaks were relied on heavily for food, okay? So all of the things that this plant can provide to us and has provided relatively willingly, unlike animals which do not provide us those same kind of services willingly. You're gonna have to chase them down to get their stuff. That's not what plants are. Okay. So here is what I'm gonna put together for you. Now you probably have not heard this in this form, so I'm gonna allow yourself to digest it. The loss of biodiversity, I mean, globally, is directly tied to the loss of indigeneity. I'm going to say that again. The loss of biodiversity is directly tied to the loss of indigeneity, right? As indigenous peoples of the world have been, will be displaced from their homelands, right? This means that there's a loss, not to those people, but it's a loss to the ecosystem in general. Now, we've all heard the statistic. 5% of the Earth's indigenous people are 5% of the Earth's population and protect 80% of Earth's biodiversity, right? So we've heard that a bunch. But why in the devil are there so few indigenous people? How do they only currently make up 5% of the Earth's population? Questions, right? How does this happen, right? Here's the question. Is the de-indigenization of human beings the reason for the loss of biodiversity? Now, we're going somewhere, stay with me. What is de-indigenization? De-indigenization is the displacement, the replacement, or assimilation of people indigenous to a particular part of the earth. Okay, so what does this have to do with us? Why are we talking about this now? We're talking about the context of the United States here in this thing, because while we're talking about in the global framework, we're here in the United States. Unless you are indigenous to Turtle Island, which is what indigenous people here call it, you are an indigenous person who has been displaced to here, okay? I'm going to say that again. Unless you are indigenous to here, you are an indigenous person who has been displaced to here. Okay. And this is the result of European colonization. All right. In fact, the climate change crisis is the result of Western European colonization and the subsequent Industrial Revolution, which all are wrapped up in the de-indigenization of peoples around the world. Right. That starts first in Europe. The de-indigenization, the loss of the sacred forest of the Druids, the loss of the sacred forest of Donner's Oak in Germany, right? The displacement of Scottish people, the displacement of Irish people, who then had to flock in droves to what is now New York, right? Displacement of indigenous peoples causes the loss of biodiversity. Now, that all sounds rather depressing because it is, and it's true, right? We can't move forward until we actually understand what happened. How did we get into this particular version of this mess? Okay, so here's the question. Is there a reversal to the loss of biodiversity? And because if we go back to the premise that the loss of biodiversity is directly tied to the loss of indigenous people, right, and indigeneity, the ways of indigenous people, then the natural question would be: is then there a reversal of the indigenization? And the answer to both of those is yes, of course, right? How? Let me tell you my own story. So I am clearly a person of African descent, right? My ancestors were captured in what is now Nigeria and displaced, indigenous people to Southwest Nigeria, displaced to Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, where I currently live. Okay, we are indigenous people who Europeans tried to de-indigenize. So what is the process of de-indigenization? This is the process of changing names, changing language so that you don't know your sacred plants, you don't know your food, you don't know your clothing, your clothing traditions, you don't know your sacred traditions. That is de-indigenization, right? And so that you then have to rely on some larger entity to be able to supply you with the basic needs of your life. This is what I mean by this. The basic needs are food, clothing, shelter, medicine, those sorts of things, right? All over the world, indigenous people provide, those things are provided locally, right? So how did this happen and how did this apply to people? Like, this is my story, right? I am lucky enough to know exactly where my people come from and for our indigenous culture in my homeland to be alive and well, right? What does this mean for people who are of European descent, right? What happened to that indigeneity? Part of that is locked in hidden in plain sight with a lot of stuff around. Let's take the instance of fairies in the British Isles. So many fairies are associated with flowers. Let's take the bluebell. So with that cosmology of indigenous people of the British Isles, what is now the British Isles, you weren't supposed to pick bluebells, right? So what does it mean? What is the ripple effect of having an area that is off limits to human beings? This is very common among indigenous cultures around the world, by the way, is to have places that are off limits to human beings, okay? Because of a spiritual aspect. And so those pieces of that indigenous cosmology, the way of seeing cosmology, the way of seeing the world, helps to continue to protect biodiversity. We can take the example of Iceland, right? Who will move roads, right? Or change road plans because elves, exist in a particular place. That is part of the way of a cosmology, how they see themselves as being a part of a particular place on the earth, not as sovereign, not as dominant force, but as a part of that is the indigenous framework. Again, and I mean this globally. Okay. And so this is about how to be in balance. The lost biodiversity is directly tied to the loss of indigenous people, right? And indigenous management and science and all the things that go along with the long history of a particular people in a particular place of the earth. Okay, so if the people go, so will the plants, right? If the people come back, the plants can come back. Okay, so I will leave it there. Again, I know you've probably never heard this in this form before. This might be new to you. And because I've had my own journey and my own long relationship with indigenous people who are indigenous to here, I know this to be true.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's a really interesting perspective. And yes, I'd like to echo Justin's suggestion that people go to the Q&A and put in some questions there, because we're about to have Mark Hertsgaard moderating a discussion. But Justin, I really wanted to say I appreciate so much that perspective. It's a very fresh perspective to a lot of us. And yeah, it's a good question to, at what point do we become re-indigenous, where we learn enough and adapt enough to our environment that we are truly part of it in a way that, people have not been really part of their environments for the last few hundred years because of all the moving around that we've been doing across the globe. So thank you. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mark Hertsgaard. Mark has published 7 books that have been translated into 16 languages, including one called Bravehearts, Whistleblowing in the Age of Snowden. I hope you heard that, sorry. He has reported from 25 countries on politics, culture, and the environment for leading publications. He is environmental correspondent for The Nation, and he lives in San Francisco with his daughter, Chiara. So Mark, thank you so much for coming to moderate this discussion and to add your own perspective. How would you like to start?
Well, thanks for having me, and it's nice to be back with the Environmental Forum of Marin. I've had the pleasure of participating in your workshops and conferences for a number of years now. So thanks again for having me. I should add in that in terms of my bio, my current role is I remain the environment correspondent at The Nation magazine, but I am also the executive director of an organization called Covering Climate Now. That is a global consortium of news organizations, that about 450 news organizations, and they reach a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people, all of us working to improve coverage of the climate story, which, as has been mentioned, is really the crisis of our time. But I want to congratulate EFM for tying climate change to biodiversity, because I would argue that these really are, as has been said, closely intertwined crises. And a little bit on my personal background of reporting this, I have spent quite a bit of my career overseas. I've traveled around the world twice to investigate the environmental future and various other aspects of global politics. And I saw in my reporting, where I spent many years actually overseas in Africa, in Asia, in South America, et cetera. And you see the way these issues come together. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more from the standpoint of a journalist. I'm not a scientist. I interview scientists, but I also have had the honor, really, of being on the ground in many of these places where indigenous people are fighting the fight to protect biodiversity. I'm thinking back to David Ackerley's fine presentation earlier in this session, and it reminded me of one of my favorite lines from the great scholar E.O. Wilson, who once wrote, of course, he was a big, big fan of ants. In case you haven't read his books, you should read his books. He even wrote a novel about ants. But he once said about ants, humans could not live without ants, but they don't depend on us for anything. And I think that's a really good thing to bear in mind as we think about all of this, this whole question of biodiversity and climate change, that we are part of the earth. We are part of this web of life. And the modern industrial capitalist mindset that permeates all of our society, and indeed has colonized our minds, mitigates entirely in the other direction, especially here in the United States with our strong emphasis on individualism. So I really appreciate what both Justin Robinson and David Ackerley have said here about that web of life. And I will, before moderating questions from all of you to them, I would just like to offer in a couple of things that are current now. Justin mentioned that there's 5%, about 5% of the human population currently are indigenous peoples, and that they nevertheless, they occupy lands that support 80% of the biodiversity on the planet. Now, I'm going to differ a little bit with Justin on one aspect of this, where he said, oh, we hear this all the time. With all due respect, Justin, we don't. People in the field maybe hear it all the time. I work with news organizations where, believe me, that is not what they're talking about. They should be, but it's not, sadly. And that's one of the things that we try and do at Covering Climate Now, is to get much smarter climate science, and for that matter, biological science, into coverage. I think if people did know that, they would have a different attitude towards all of these questions. So let me just repeat it. 5% of the population, how many people is that? It's roughly 370 million people around the world, 370 million. They occupy 25% of the land surface. Okay, so 5% of the people, 25% of the land, but 80% of the biodiversity. So that really gives you this exponential difference, where essentially it is in those places where the indigeneity, as Justin Robinson was putting it, you really see the benefits of that is where the biodiversity remains. And we now have considerable peer-reviewed science that demonstrates what is kind of common sense, if you will, that really when we talk about protecting biodiversity and keeping forests standing, which I can't tell you how many dozens of international conferences and seminars and papers that I've read that talk about this, and governments talking about, we're going to do this and we're going to fund this kind of program. The one thing, the only thing that works, according to peer-reviewed science, is when you protect the land and civil rights of the indigenous peoples who live there. And what does that mean? It means protecting them against the forces that are driving this destruction. And that's what I have had the privilege and also a little bit the danger of observing firsthand as a reporter. For example, in the Amazon, I spent quite a bit of time with a group called the Pastoral Land Commission, and that is a religiously oriented nonprofit organization that protects the rights of both indigenous people and landless people in the Amazon. And what you see when you are there is that it's basically the same old story of inequality that exists in so much of this world, where the powerful interests who want to take that land and turn it into either cattle plantations or soybean plantations, or if you transplant that same scenario into Asia, it's usually palm oil plantations, that they simply go in and they steal this land and they level the forests, sell what they can, but really the profit comes from turning that land into agricultural production. Now, of course, the people who live there resist that and they fight that. And the fights often get violent. And so at The Nation magazine, we did a story I highly commend to all of you, August 30th of 2018, so roughly 3 years ago, where we sent a very brave and brilliant reporter down into the Amazon who reported on this and was in places where these so-called land defenders were literally in pitched bloody battles with the forces of destruction, who in that case were tied in with the local sheriff, but also with the so-called ruralistas. These are the agribusiness, what we would call the agribusiness lobby, who want to turn those lands into, as I say, soy or cattle fields. Next, let's see, what's today? Today's the 9th. So 4 days from now, there will be a new report that documents how so many of these land defenders around the world are being murdered. So talk about your civil rights and human rights being violated. They're being murdered by these forces. And so again, remember the combination here. We know from peer-reviewed science that the one way to keep those forests standing, to keep biodiversity rich, and also, by the way, to pursue our climate goals by keeping those forests standing so they can draw down carbon from the atmosphere. The one thing that works is to protect those people's civil rights and land ownership rights. And we now in Brazil, there is a very, very bad situation because the current government there is run by, as some of you will know, a man named Bolsonaro, who is essentially a Donald Trump in Brazilian form. And he has slashed all the environmental regulations. But it's important to realize that that is not destiny. And in fact, Brazil, if you go back 10 years or so, a little more than 10 years, actually was making good progress on limiting deforestation because, very simple, you had government regulations that were enforced, that were scientifically based, et cetera, et cetera. So I think maybe both David and Justin have said in this hour that a lot of this is a depressing story, and there's certainly that side of it. But I urge you not to get lost in the despair, but to realize that these are problems that can be fixed. And we have plenty of evidence that when you have strong laws and good regulation and strong social support in the society for doing that, it works. As the scientists on this panel know far better than I, if humans just take our foot off of the neck of nature, nature will spring back really quickly. But it's on us to recognize how human activities are driving these trends. And that's true in both the cases of climate change and biodiversity. There's, as I understand the science, and perhaps David can fact check me on this, the two main drivers of biodiversity loss are habitat destruction, which again is driven by the sort of the big agribusiness and logging interests that I mentioned, and climate change and the temperature and other climate impacts that are making it harder for species to survive. So those are the things, those are human activities, and they're not something that just is dropping out of the sky. They are directly related to the policies that are being implemented, and therefore to the politicians who are in office. So I think I will stop by offering a plea as you think about your work in this area. Do not, although it's very important to be concerned about your own individual lifestyle choices, that is not what's going to fix this. What is causing this are big policy changes and political forces that are driving this destruction. And if we're serious about protecting the planet, we have to have political and economic changes. And that means that politics must be committed. You may be tired of politics, but believe me, politics is not tired of you. And you can drop out or you can get involved. And if you get involved, then we can turn these things around. And we are coming up to a number of very important meetings on this. I mentioned that in September 13th, the Global Witness Organization will be releasing a new study on documenting how many land defenders are being murdered around the world. The United States State Department could be much, much more aggressive in mitigating against that kind of violence in terms of how we reach out to other governments, the kinds of pressures and incentives that we provide. Likewise, there is, of course, the Glasgow in November, there will be the next UN Global Climate Summit where all of these questions will arise. And one part of that is the so-called 30 by 30 declaration, where various countries and governments are pressing for 30% of global land area to be protected areas, made into protected areas, I should say, by 2030. But how that gets done is essential. The indigenous peoples have to have a seat at the table, which they have never been given at these kinds of meetings. I've been covering these meetings since 1992 in Brazil at the Earth Summit. And indigenous peoples, they try to get in. Sometimes you'll even see news stories that sort of look at the very colorful costumes that they wear as they parade outside of these forums, but they are never allowed in. That again is something that civil society can press for, can say, this is what the US position should be. Globally, the US is still a very powerful force internationally, to say that those voices must be heard, or we're not going to get, we may say that we're going to be doing 30% by 2030, but we will not be achieving it because we will not be working with the people who can really make it happen, the indigenous people of this planet. So I think that that's probably enough for me right now. And what we should do now is, with our remaining 25 minutes, is I will take some questions from the Q&A to deliver here to my colleagues. So, okay.
When you say that, you've got 5% of the people, 20% of the land, is 20 or 25? 25% of the land, and then so many of the species. I'm wondering whether that tells us something about the density of population that the globe can support without degradation of ecosystems.
I don't think that is necessarily connected. You can have very dense populations in places that are more environmentally sustainable or less environmentally sustainable. I think that the real dynamic there relates to how indigenous people live with the nature around them and see themselves as part of that, as opposed to an extractive mentality that alas, is the dominant mentality in the world economy today.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me start with a question from Ralph Purdy. If there is only 5% of people on the planet who are indigenous, it feels as if all is lost. This underscores the question, how do we reverse de-indigenous, boy, that's a hard one. How do we reverse de-indigenization? Justin, would you like to try that first?
Sure. That is something I've spent so much of my life understanding and doing. It's actually fairly simple, right? So this is about culture. And so this does have to happen on an individual scale, right? There's no mass version of this that can happen. This has to, because everybody's ancestry and whatever is different, right? And so what I mean by that is, one, to understand oneself as an indigenous person of somewhere on the earth. That's number one, right? Number two, if you are a displaced indigenous person, who are the indigenous people? So let me back up one more second. To me, what indigeneity is ultimately about, it is how to be a human being in a particular part of the earth, right? If you're from Mali, you're going to do a certain set of things because you're coming from a desert environment. If you are from Florida, you're going to do a certain set of things because the land demands that of human beings. If you're in Alaska, you're going to do a certain set of things as human beings to survive in that particular place, right? That's what indigeneity is about, is how to be a human in a particular place on the earth. Now, once human beings move through all the reasons that we move, migrate, sort of quote unquote normal migration, displacement, refugees, war, all that stuff, then it is turning to the place of where we are currently to learn how to be a human being in that particular place on the earth, right? Because I work in land management, one of the things here in the South is that people are obsessed with forests here, right? Because most of the land management is done by people who are of European descent, and Europe is largely forested when those people left or have the remnant of that. Where I am in the southern United States, this is actually not a forest ecosystem. This is a savanna ecosystem, right? And so trying to make this a forest ecosystem when it really is a savanna ecosystem is about not being in clear communication with the people who have already been living here, right? And so that has all of these deleterious effects all along the ecosystem, all along the ecosystem chains. So to me, it is about, one, understanding yourself as, that's the thing. First thing is understanding yourself as an indigenous person, all the things that come with that: language, music, food, all of that stuff. And if you are displaced, if you are not on the land to where you're indigenous, and remember, we may come from many different places of the earth, that if you are in a different place from any of those places, what is it to be human there, and who do we have to learn from?
Thanks, Justin. Let me move on to a question from Jim, who does not give his last name, but that's all right. This is for you, David. He says, biological systems change, migrate, etc. Do you believe in the concept of biologically precipitous tipping points that tip either for the better or for the worse? And if so, could you provide us some examples related to today?
Yeah, thanks. I saw that question and I've been thinking about it. First, I'm still thinking really hard about myself as a displaced indigenous person. I think I can't help but comment, someone made that point about anyone with a European, British Isles descent. We have not been asked to think about ourselves that way. So I can't not remark on that, because it is a very profound, I think, reconceptualizing, thinking of our own relationship. I just want to thank Justin for the challenge he's posing us here. Now, this question, though, is a very good Western science question about tipping points in our worldviews. Actually, that's not just Western, it's a thing about a lot of parts of the world. Tipping points are, for those who haven't thought about it, it's actually a very large category of phenomena about systems that can kind of maintain some form of stability, but when they pass a certain point, they flip. And in fact, the simple metaphor is exactly where it comes from. Literally, if you've ever sailed a boat or been in a kayak or a canoe or anything, or watched a boat, if they tip a little bit, they actually self-stabilize. That's the nature of ballast and the physics. And there's a tipping point. There is literally a point where the boat doesn't stabilize and it flips. And it does not return. So being upside down is a stable state for a boat. as is being right side up. And there's literally a tipping point where the boat will either rewrite itself or suddenly flip. And that, so the physics behind it is actually, there's a lot of physical systems where we really understand the physics of why systems have these points where they flip. So, and there's fascinating examples in climate, in society, in nature. For the purposes of our discussion, the best examples actually come from fire ecology. And I rather mention one. If you have a forest that burns lightly, the trees drop seeds, the seeds, the seedlings can germinate, you have tree seedlings coming up. If they're big enough, they survive the next fire. And this is really thinking about like a conifer forest in the Sierra, especially. Once you get a high severity fire that's say half a kilometer wide and all the trees are dead, that's the middle of that patch is too far away from the surviving trees for any seeds to reach it. And now you get shrubs that come up. So it's not just that you lose the trees. It's the shrubs are more flammable. And when they burn hotter and they burn more frequently. So the system has changed and it now has an internal dynamic that will keep it in the new state. And you have to really go in and do a very significant intervention to get it back out of that state, back to a forest, just like flipping a boat that has gone upside down. It takes a lot of work to get it back. So there's quite a few examples from fire ecology where one ecosystem, after it goes past a certain transition, becomes sort of a kind of self-stabilizing, and going back is very different. Now, trees to shrubs may not, that may not seem like an earth shattering, it's still vegetation. There's actually examples from desertification, from the way that vegetation influences rainfall. Some of the scariest examples are things like melting of the ice pack, where a certain amount of warming sets off melting, and the reduced ice pack reduces the amount of energy being reflected to the sun, and that actually increases the warming. And now you're in kind of a runaway until you come to some new state where other factors come in. And so climate has these really, really frightening tipping point dynamics. The problem is it's very hard to know when you've crossed a tipping point until much later. That's maybe one of the main uncertainties. It's like, by the time you know it, it's probably too late and it's very hard to go back. And that's why there's so much anxiety and uncertainty about, are we approaching tipping points, and when would we know if we are in ecosystems or climate systems?
David, a quick follow-up on that from me, if you don't mind. I don't know how many people read it, but you all should. In The Guardian today, there's an excellent thought-provoking opinion piece by George Monbiot, the British writer, talking about tipping points and saying that, we could very well cross climate tipping points well before we think. The sort of standard narrative on that holds that, once you get over 2 degrees Celsius or even 3 degrees, which is where we're heading currently, of global warming beyond the pre-industrial era, that's where you could reach tipping points. But Monbiot was saying that, in fact, look around you today, and it's very possible that we're much closer to tipping points, even though we've only had 1.1 degree of temperature rise. And he points in specifically to the what is sort of in popular parlance called the jet stream, which is the meridional water flow that basically goes across the Atlantic Ocean, around the world, but across the Atlantic Ocean from the Caribbean towards Western Europe, and essentially makes it possible to have a vibrant civilization in Britain and Northern Europe. And he pointed out that there is increasing scientific studies suggesting that is getting close to a tipping point. He says in general systems, when they're getting ready to tip, and this is what I'd like you to comment on, he says they begin to flicker, almost like a light switch begins to flicker. And that's how you can tell that they're about to tip. It's like with the kayak, when it's really going like that, that tells you that it may be happening. Is he on solid ground there? And what's your take? I know you're not a climate scientist, but a tree.
Yeah, I've read lightly in this area, not much of the technical literature. I guess all that's worth saying is that there are some systems that exhibit that flickering, and therefore that's a really important phenomenon that people have picked up on. But I do remember also reading that not all systems. So we can't count on seeing those dynamics as a sign that we're approaching tipping points, but it's possible we are. So it's a possibility, but as I said, there could be others that we approach. I mean, think about the example I gave. A high severity fire isn't preceded by any flickering, right? It's just like, oh, this big phenomenon came through and just set us into a new place. So I think I think that would be one of a range of kind of dynamics of how these systems can change, and certainly one we should be paying attention to.
Okay. Let's go to a question from Marty for Justin. Your perspective is new to me, makes perfect sense. My question is, Indigenous people, I assume, develop their respect and knowledge for their local ecosystems over a long period of time, and with the ability to listen deeply. Both of these things seem in short supply now. Therefore, what will make it possible for us to acquire these abilities in time to make a real difference? But Justin, please feel free to, are those the abilities that are indeed crucial to Indigenous people developing that point of view?
Absolutely. This is very much about listening, right? Listening to what Indigenous people, wherever they are in the world, and wherever you are, right, is listen to what they have to say. What if literally what they have been trying to say for however long is just true, right? Or the ways that they like suspend disbelief, right? Suspend the belief of superstition and all this stuff. Let's just say that they know what they're talking about, right? What could be possible in that space, right? I mean, I happen to know some Native people from Southern California, and the way that they manage the land, right? All the things that we've been talking about now about fires and all this other stuff, accounted for all of that, right? Now, some of this has been exacerbated by, certainly climate change and by non-native plants and by all kinds of other things, right? But the question is always, what would happen if we just did, quote unquote, what the science of Indigenous people has already proven to work for however many thousands of years in a given location, right? Of course, things change, right? That is, we're not expecting some fake idea of stability, right? That's not a real thing on the earth, right? It's constantly moving, but we would be able to move with it, right? As opposed to only be moved by it, right? So like thinking about a boat versus a dock, right? When the tide comes up or comes too high, the boat's going to go up or down or whatever. The dock is not movable, right? It's going to come crashing down. We have to be the boat and not the dock, right? To put another boat metaphor here. But yeah, I think this is just about listening, suspending our ideas because what we carry with us is the old stuff, right? From wherever the place that we come from before, we carry the old stuff, right? And so if we're in a new place, the old stuff may no longer serve us because the place is different, right? My people come from the equator where we need a particular amount of sun per year. We don't, as people of discolored skin, we don't get enough sun, right? So the old stuff, right, of just being able to get enough vitamin D just by being alive doesn't work here. We now have to take supplements. Otherwise, we're going to suffer, right? And so just because we didn't need that there in this place, right, it would be foolish of us, of people of that extraction, to continue to do the old thing, which is the old thing is not having to do anything, right? The new thing, the new state requires you to do something else, right? And so that is the place we need to be walking into. What does the place require of us as human beings? And the people who can answer that best, right now, people are fallible, but the people who can answer that best are the Indigenous people of a given place. What is the land telling you, right? They can answer that question best.
Because they've been listening the longest?
Yep. And they've made more mistakes, right? They've made the mistakes, right? If we just think about this as science, right, as the way we think about anything else, the more you do the thing, the better it doesn't mean that you won't mess up, but it won't mean that you won't make rudimentary mistakes. Right? You will absolutely make mistakes, but the kinds of mistakes you will make will be so sophisticated in comparison, right? You're just ahead of the game, right? I always say, do you want somebody who's been cooking, do you want the food of somebody who's been cooking for 3 weeks or 30 years, right? I'm going to take the person who's been cooking for 30 years, right? And so we don't have to reinvent everything. We don't have to discover everything newly. We have to continue to move because the earth is a dynamic place in which we live, but we don't have to reinvent everything.
I love that. It brings to mind a favorite quote of mine from one of the world's great writers who is probably about as far away from biodiversity and climate change as you can imagine, but Beckett, who once wrote, try again, fail again, try again, fail better. Let's go to one question. Actually, let me jump in here because I see a number of questions here about population. So let me quickly address that. And then I've got a question for you, David. People talking about is population, do we need population stabilization? Population is a very big topic. It's a complicated topic. In my book, Earth Odyssey, if you're interested, you can look at the chapter I wrote. That was actually set largely in Brazil. But the sort of the elevator pitch on this is that population, yes, it's important, but it is nowhere near as important as consumption in terms of driving these global patterns. And the easiest way to imagine that is if you look at the environmental footprint, or say the carbon footprint is a little easier to calculate. The carbon footprint of a child, a baby born in the United States, today will be roughly compared to that of 53 children who are born in Bangladesh, and a shocking 153 in Benin. So if you're thinking that the problem is population, look at the math. That's the population growth can be a problem, but it tends to be a problem for the people who are experiencing overcrowding in a given area. It's not what is driving the global threats for the most part here. So let me move on here to David. Here's a question for you from Sally Gale. Ecosystem migration sounds hopeful. Can you give more examples of species finding new habitats and therefore surviving habitat degradation?
It's an excellent question, and I should probably have more examples that's right on the tip of my tongue because I think about it a lot. I can, one that we've seen a good example of, or I mentioned oaks in the Sierra. I know there's probably better examples from butterflies. There's butterflies moving north, some on the West Coast. A lot of birds, actually in California, we have a very unusual opportunity because Grinnell, the founder of our zoology museum at Berkeley, was out of the 1920s sampling very intensively in a very detailed way the small mammal and the small bird populations. And Berkeley scientists have been able to go back in the last 15 years to exactly the same places that Grinnell went in the 1920s. We've seen a bunch of small mammals in Yosemite that are now living at higher elevations than they did then. So we've seen some of the mammal change. I know there's other examples from around the world. I think there's two caveats that come with it. One is, as I agree with you, it's hopeful because I really do. We know it's the key to nature surviving in the long term. What's interesting is that we see is that, and I think I said this really quickly in passing. Change is necessary for nature to survive. It doesn't mean all change is good. And this is the real challenge because, so there's other examples of bird populations changing since the 1920s, but they've been declining, or they've been, maybe they're moving because they're shrinking to the last place they can survive. So how do we recognize the difference between a change that we believe is adaptive and really a sign that this species might be moving quickly enough or adapting quickly enough, versus changes that are simply, I hate to say this, sort of a last gasp of something that is really just shrinking down to a final refuge. And then now we're just in the weeds. This is just on the ground. This kind of retail science. There's no big wholesale answer here. It's a case by case and a study by study. And I think for a lot of conservation biology, and again, I know this is kind of my theme here, lack of change was an easy thing to all agree on. And then it was really easy to recognize, because then all change was a failure to conserve, and maintain a lack of change. But now once we start accepting change, it doesn't mean that it's all desirable or favorable in the sense of these systems surviving. Now we really have to get down and thinking very hard about what kind of changes are those adaptive signs of nature, responding in the ways we hope. I'll make a very final comment, just because this is what my own lab's research is really focused on. Often when we think of movement, we think, okay, species have to move north towards the poles, or they have to move uphill. What I've been really interested in is when you get a very rugged landscape, and I work in Sonoma County and Marin County in the Coast Ranges, and you have these very rugged topography with little valleys and little hills. The difference in temperature between the south-facing slope of the hillside and the north-facing slope is usually on the order of 3 degrees Celsius on the annual average, not just one day. And 3 degrees is, for the moment, on the order of magnitude of the change we're anticipating in this century. So a species moving from the south side of a hill to the north side actually could offset 3 degrees of warming, and it doesn't have to go very far at all. And that's hopeful, because then we have some movements that could be very local. We might barely notice them, and much more feasible because the dispersal distances the plants and animals need to move are so much shorter. And in other cases, we see that moving downhill into the ocean could be the adaptive response, because it's always colder by the ocean in California. So it could be downhill, could be uphill, could be over the side of the hill. So don't only think going up the Sierra or going north to Oregon kind of thing, because a lot of this might be playing at a much finer scale. And that's where we spend a lot of our research energy, just trying to dig into the details of that and look for the possibilities, and how managers can then use that as a tool in their management at a local land management scale.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to stop you there because we are 2 minutes from our closing point, and it's always good practice to finish on time. David Ackerley, Justin Robinson, thank you so much. I'm Mark Hertsgaard. I'll turn it back over to Anne Christine.
Thank you. I was going to begin by thanking our speakers too. David and Justin, that was wonderful. And Mark, I really appreciated your pulling it together and taking the questions at the end. Just some really amazing perspectives there. I think I'm going to be considering many of them for days to come. We really appreciate your sharing your time and expertise. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support of our program. And they have given us some actions that they suggest people take that will help support biodiversity. And also, I'd like to remind people one more time that we do have one more event, which is actually about local biodiversity, as the title says, on land, at sea, and on TAM. That's going to be on September 29th, I believe. Environmental Forum of Marin will be sending you the links to that to register. Thank you. To register in an email that we're going to follow up with. So thank you all. Thank you, our audience, for showing up to learn more about this really important topic. And you all have a good evening and enjoy. Thank you. Bye-bye.